And welcome back to Scarred for Life, the podcast where we open up old wounds by looking back at the films that scared us as kids. I'm Terry.
And I'm Mary Beth.
In each episode, our special guest brings with them a movie that traumatized them as a child.
This week, our guest is writer and director Stewart Thorndike. Stewart's feature film debut, Lyle, debuted at Outfest in 2014 with rave reviews, and her latest film, Bad Things, is currently streaming on Shudder. Welcome to the show, Stewart.
Hi.
Yay!
I'm so happy to be here. Talking trauma.
Yeah, talking trauma. So much trauma. But before we do get to that traumatic aspect of the show, can you tell listeners a little bit about Bad Things?
Bad Things is the story of a woman who inherits a hotel from her family, and she inherits more than just the hotel. So she arrives at the hotel that she inherits with her three friends, and she's sort of debating if she wants to keep it or not. And they're going to have this good weekend, but one of them is not supposed to be there. She's an uninvited guest, and the hotel is known as a place where women do bad things, and they laugh it off at first, but then as more and more strange things start to happen, they wonder if maybe it's the guest, the unhinged guest, maybe it is the hotel, or maybe it's something else. With Ruthie Nod.
I love everything about the space and this movie. The aesthetic sensibility of this movie is just so very womb-like, but also kind of gross, which I love that combo of gross and womb-like. And I wanted to hear more about how you shaped that aesthetic. And I think when I spoke with you for Dread Central, you found that the hotel already kind of looked like that, right? So did you want that aesthetic, or did you kind of stumble into it with the setting that you found?
I knew I wanted something feminine. I wanted something that felt like it was of the mother. And I didn't know exactly what that was. And it's funny that you say gross, because this would have looked really great and fancy 20 years ago, but now it just is nostalgic, and nostalgia is icky and terrifying sometimes.
A little dusty, and it's not gross, but it's just it just is falling apart. You know what I mean? Just not taken care of, dilapidated. Cool. I don't know.
I look at it as some prom was about to happen, and then everybody just left and no one came back, and there's sort of broken dreams and dirty secrets.
Hell yeah.
Lots of dirty secrets.
Just a couple.
I was curious because what I was really, well, first of all, before I even watched the movie, I knew that Hari Nef was in it, and I was really excited because I love her work. But then I started realizing just how queer it was. Was this something that kind of you went into with an intention of doing, or did it sort of just happen with the characters along the way? How did that kind of come together?
I think it's just a reflection of my life. I'm a queer woman, and no, I don't set out, but I write from a personal perspective, and so the politics always come from that. So the queerness of it is just very natural.
I love that.
Cool.
And I love that because again, I feel like we're living in a world where I think natural queerness is happening more, but it's not it's not happening as much as it should be. And I love living in a world that just is inherently not straight and a little bit off kilter from what you would expect, but it feels like home, I think, for a lot of us queers, where it's I love even to the costuming, Hari Nef's outfits. I'm obsessed with the way she dresses and the way that you capture queerness again, and then the aesthetics of it. And I'm curious how you worked with the costume and wardrobe departments to shape the looks of each character, because I feel like they each have their very own, very specific look about them that they carry throughout the film.
Yeah, again, I really think it's important to have other people telling stories, and so one of those reasons is because I don't know, this is really maybe too sweeping to say, but I don't know how much guys get clothes sometimes. And I think for me, there's a lot of biography in clothing, and there's a lot of storytelling and history in clothing, and who's sharing, and that stuff really matters to me. Everything matters, the way the camera moves, the way the location looks, the way the story is being told, the way you cast, And the set design and the costumes are just as important to me as all those other things. So collaborating with Nell Simons, our costume director, and with these actors who are all style geniuses, you know, they really are referencing 18 million things at once and understanding a lot and really bringing their character into the story of their wardrobe and stuff. And so it was something that was very labored over and thought about, just like every aspect of the film. And the actors really contributed. Hari, you can imagine, had great ideas and got it, you know, just understood, and massive collaborations there.
That's
Same
so
with
cool.
everybody. Same with everybody in this story. Everybody had like, you know, I was in thrift stores with Gail all the time, like, oh, this coat.
I know that struggle though, like literally in thrift stores being like, I think this could work, and being like, I'm not sure which variation of giant men's clothing could work, but I want it to work. And then you really do find amazing things in thrift stores though, for like sourcing. For if you're making a movie, go to thrift stores and look for clothes there. I promise you'll find something cool usually.
Well, it's
you won't
funny,
have multiples though. That's the only problem.
That's the problem, is your costume designer will hate you because, you know, especially when you're making a horror film and you know there's going to be blood all over things, you need multiples, and you can't do that with vintage stuff.
That's true.
You can't.
Unless you have a genius costume designer like I did, who could make yellow robes that are going to get blood on them.
That's so cool. Like that's so cool. Movie making is neat. But do you have any more questions about bad things before I'm moving on, like, to broader questions? Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious, Stuart, how you got into horror. Like, has horror been a thing your whole life? Like, how did you get introduced to the horror genre, like in general? Not just as movies. Like, was it books? Was it something else? Like, what was your entry into the genre?
I was always interested in dark, I would say real stuff. Like I didn't like cartoons when I was little. They made me nervous, all the chasing and noises. And I really liked the big impact. The big thing I remember is seeing my first Twilight Zone, and just the massive connection with it. And just like, my thought was like, okay, so wait, so grown-ups made this? And I felt a lot of comfort in it, and a lot of like, oh, okay, so not everything is just like telling me that you should be in this big white happy family where, you know, that I didn't quite relate to, where everybody's biggest problem is which laundry detergent. I don't know what the stories were, but sometimes those things feel like alienating. And I liked seeing melodramas and stories where people were dealing with big things. Do you guys know that the Lonely Doll books by Dare Wright?
Why is that familiar?
There's a book that's really great. That she was a woman from the 50s.
Oh,
60s.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she made these pictures. They were very film noir, of a doll and who does bad things, actually. But I would sit alone and read those books, and they were very important to me. And I don't know why, but then when you read the book later and you find out about the woman who's making those books, Dare Wright, you understand that she's got an intense intensity and darkness in her. Ooh. So you know, that was what I felt aligned with.
So cool. Okay, I need to dig deeper into this later.
Yeah, I do too. Like, the cover looks familiar, but I don't think I know anything about them. So
they went out of print for a long time, and I thought I hallucinated them, and it turns out that so did a lot of people. And then someone found her and wrote her biography, and it's just this crazy story.
Whoa. Okay. Yep. All right. Gonna have to.
Yep. I've just added that to my list of things to check out.
But there was a definite darkness there, and that was what I, you know, felt was reflected of kind of my mood and my truth. Did
you watch a lot of horror movies as a kid?
I did not. I grew up in like a Christian.
Gotcha.
I mean, you know, like my mom moved. I was a single mom, and she moved all the time, and yeah, I don't really have access to that.
Right. Okay. Cool. So did you like, was it reading a lot of how you got access to like to darker things, like with the Lonely Doll and like other books and stuff? Were you like a reader as a kid?
No, wasn't a
Okay,
reader.
cool.
All
Cool.
my friends were, and my family are big readers. I was raised a lot by my cousin, with my cousins in my grandma's house. But I was
Okay.
more of a drawer, and I would write dark
Okay.
stories, and I would make,
Oh, okay.
I would make books, and I would. That was like I was very shy, but I could, you know, win over the crowd with my darkness, I guess, and my
I
like
love being that
my
kid that everyone's like,
bad.
oh, you're kind of weird, but you're cool. And it's like, thanks. That's me. Like I had a similar experience as a kid too, like writing weird things too.
Isn't that
Like
funny? Like
seriously.
that was, yeah. So I could, yeah, it was a little bit of a con, but you know,
So how did you like dig into like that subject matter? Like as you got older, were you consuming more media like that, right? And or just creating your own stories? Like how did you kind of start digging into genre as you like as you were getting, growing up and maybe getting more of an interest in filmmaking or things like that?
I mean, as soon as I did have access, so I could watch melodramas and I loved those. I loved old movies. And then as
Cool.
soon as I did have access, I would start watching like David Lynch and Cronenberg
Okay.
and
Hell yeah. Okay.
Kubrick, and that was the sliver of horror that was for me. Not
Okay.
necessarily. I did go and see some slashers and stuff like that, but that didn't really
Okay.
do it for me.
You like headier
Gotcha.
stuff then. You love the cool, like surreal, not always surreal, but like yeah,
I
Cronenberg and
must
Lynch.
say, I was pretty arty as a youngster. Like, I
Hell
was
yeah.
like, I could do Bergman. Now I can't. And I don't know what that was about. Like, I think I was smarter or something when I was younger. No, I still like Bergman, but I don't choose to watch it on a Tuesday night. And
Right.
back then I was just insatiable.
I feel like when you're younger, you're insatiable and like you want to watch everything, even if you haven't experienced it. And I feel like as you get older, you're like, it's not my taste as much. Like I'm not in the mood for a Bergman movie. And it's like I'm tired. Like
I know. I remember once being like, it's weird, but I want to watch Pelican Brief. Like, I wanted to see a Julia Roberts movie, and I was like, who is this person? So it was like I suddenly allowed that kind of stuff into my life, but it was a very specific moment.
So I'm curious because you mentioned Kubrick, and I noticed on your IMDb page that you were in Eyes Wide Shut.
I know it is cool and wild. I was a Kubrick, lover, and I was in London. I modeled a little bit, and I was like, how can I get on the set? How can I be,
hell yeah.
a PA or in the background? And it's crazy, but I got a part.
That's so cool.
It's crazy.
Wild.
It's against the odds. It was like crazy how that I got that.
What was it like being on that set? Because it's I mean, like that movie, I remember seeing it in the movie theater opening weekend and being like, this is a wild like dream. I don't know what's happening in it. I was so young. I don't know what's going on, but like what was the set like?
I mean, I didn't have anything to compare it to, so that
Right.
really confused me when I did act later, especially with the audition process. I was like, don't we have 2 weeks to like me try out a billion different ways for 8 hours a day? Like the set was just, how would I explain it? It was Kubrick, moving. He did his own lighting. He had these like, I was in the party scene, so we had these like big Christmas movable like things with fairy lights and colored lights, and he would just move them around. And he was very collaborative and funny.
Hmm.
He wanted, I wasn't an actor, and it was bound up. I was playing, if you want to be really truthful about it, modeling is weird. I was playing a babe. I didn't really feel comfortable in that whole, like, I wanted to be a director.
Right.
And so I felt like
Okay.
my creative presence was a little bit confused to me and stifled. And I
Oh
really
yeah.
respect acting, and I wasn't really comfortable. Like I said before, I was very shy.
Right.
And so it was very overwhelming for me. And I would have felt more comfortable probably like picking the costumes out with somebody or something. But I loved
Yeah.
the experience. I mean,
Well, yeah, of course. I can
incredible.
imagine like your first your first introduction to being on a movie set is a Kubrick film. That's I
It's
wouldn't even know
crazy.
what to do with that. Yeah.
I remember being so scared because it was crazy because, I mean, this sounds like I had this very glamorous life, and I guess I did, but it didn't feel like a good time or creatively satisfying during it. But I was in Italy. I was supposed to have a bigger part in the movie. And then they said, we're sorry. And that has its own story. But then as a consolation, they gave me the smaller part and they flew me back. And I remember they had a driver pick me up at the airport, and it was so surreal. And I drove to Luton Hoo where they were shooting. And I was so nervous that I asked the driver, and they said, oh, just go in and find Tom and Stanley in this big mansion. And I was like, by myself? Like, I don't want to. And I asked my driver that they'd gotten me if he would come in with me, and he wouldn't do it because I was so nervous.
Oh.
But you said that you knew you wanted to be a director when you had worked on that movie. Like, did you know, or like, did you have like an inkling that you wanted to work behind the camera?
I did, but I didn't know how you would do it.
Right.
Okay.
I didn't know, it's less like mysterious now. I think people know, I think, with, video and being able to just figure it out. But I just didn't know the first thing you would need to do to do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, exactly. Cool. Well, okay, Stuart, we've talked about your life and your creative work, but what movie did you bring with you today for us to discuss?
Well, Threads, and it is traumatizing. I watched it again before we talked. I'm like, oh, why am I doing this?
So, for the uninitiated, Threads is a film about the effects of a nuclear holocaust on the working class city of Sheffield, England, and the eventual long-term effects of nuclear war on civilization.
Very, very, light stuff.
Light.
Had you guys seen it before?
So
Yes.
it's funny because, like, for me, I had never heard of this movie until Severin Films, which is like this boutique Blu-ray label that does like genre and horror, put out the Threads, and I bought it because I heard this is the most disturbing movie ever. And so I bought it, but I hadn't watched it until last year. We have like a mini episode that we kind of do, and so Mary Beth and I both watched it for that and just sort of experienced it. So this is the second time I've watched it, the second time in like about a year, I think, that we've seen it.
Whoa, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I had I knew about it, but I hadn't watched it before then because I was just like, I don't need to. Because here, the thing about me, no, you know what? We'll talk about that after. I want to hear Stuart's story first before we talk about me. But Stuart, I want to hear your story about how you first saw Threads, like how it affected you, your Scarred for Life story about this movie.
So I can't remember the first time I watched it. It feels like but it's clung over me, like it kind of changed me is what I would say.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's a moment in it where it's the moment towards the end where the kids are watching a video about words and objects. Yep. And I was like, oh no. And like, it's like, at first it feels like you're watching a very traumatic experience on a time and place in a family. And then all of a sudden it's like, it goes into this sort of freaky back in time assault against the entire scope of humanity. And it's like, okay, I thought we were going to talk about like fallout and burns from radiation, not like the loss of language.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting that myself. I'd heard Threads. I'd seen like the photo. There's like I think the photo that Severin even uses is there's a guy in a uniform that has his head bandaged up and there's like a blood spot. And I see that, and it's such a, I don't know, there's such a visceral reaction to that image. It's like, what is this movie about? And I just assumed, because there's a lot of like nuclear movies that came out in like the 80s, and it's always about like the moment of, or like the right after the moments, and I was kind of expecting that. I was not anticipating a film that was going to lead you on this path and then show you that civilization is pretty much fucked for the rest of eternity after this, and I was not ready for that.
Yeah, I think that's what makes it so epic and such an assault. Like, there's this combination of the everydayness in the beginning and just like the denial. The denial is terrifying. And that's
Yes.
what's maybe the most terrifying for us right now, living in
Yes.
our world with climate change and everything. Like our capacity for denial is totally terrifying. But then what you just said and where it goes into this, like, it's almost like pulling you back in time to medieval times or something. Like, your humanity is hanging on by a thread.
And it brings to mind, like, I think this movie encapsulates, there's like I don't know, I just remember there's being a saying about like the first war is fought with rocks and sticks, the second war with guns, the third war with nuclear weapons, the fourth war with guns, with rocks and sticks. Like it's like that circular. And so like this, I think, encapsulates that, because by the end of this movie, we are back to language is not known. Like, people are struggling with figuring out words. The place is literally a corpse. England, like the UK, is nothing but a corpse. And I think that's funny that there's like a moment early on in the movie where they're like, what would people conquer if they dropped the bomb? It would be picking up like the skin off of a dead corpse. And that is basically what this movie is in its essence. And it's just so bleak.
Bleak is the word.
It is so bleak. And it, like, you know, we've seen movies like what was The Wind?
When the Wind Blows.
Have you seen When the Wind Blows, Stuart?
No, I haven't. I'm gonna write it down.
Animated British movie about nuclear holocaust. Similar vibes of Threads, except it's like two cute cartoon old people who are like trying to live through. It's heart-wrenching. There's Grave of the Fireflies, which is the Studio Ghibli take on the bombing in Japan and proper. Like, there's so many movies about this, which makes sense. But like you said, this one shows you how easy, like, it's only 13 years afterward and we've lost language. Like, that to me, I think, is crazy. Like you said, Stuart, like, we're hanging on by a thread. Like, it really isn't that difficult to send us back to a Stone Age. And I think so many post-apocalyptic movies see it as like, don't see it that way. I feel like you see The Last of Us and we still have society. We still have some kind of infrastructure. And here it's just so much bleaker. And but I kind of love that in the darkest way possible of like, well, let's imagine the scariest timeline. Like, let's not romanticize it with like things like some bittersweet stuff. Let's just make it like, oh, it's just The Hills Have Eyes. The end of this movie reminds me of almost gives me Hills Have Eyes vibes. I'm like,
yeah,
absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's just, it goes from like, it becomes a real horror movie at the end to the point where it's almost ridiculous. If that makes sense, where I'm like, this movie changed tone very quickly in a really weird way.
It is weird. And it starts doing all those stills like La Jetée, you know, like Chris Marker, and those are really terrifying. And also, I would just say the performances in it and the realism of the first half is really good. And there are so many people in it.
Many people.
They're all so good. Like, the performances are real. It's real. Like, nobody's underlining anything.
It feels like a documentary. It does feel like a documentary. Like, it's one of those movies that has that documentary feel to it. That is just like, you know, it's not real, but it feels so uncomfortably real. And I can only imagine what it was like to watch this when it aired in the 80s. You know what I mean? Like, I need to look at.
I don't know. Yeah. And that I missed, of course. But I think or not, of course, I guess. But I think I've read that people would watch it with war games.
Yes, they would. Yeah. It was shown in 1984 and it achieved really high ratings, but then it wasn't showed again for a very long time.
Well, and the wild thing is that this director Mick Jackson did The Bodyguard with Whitney Houston, which
oh my God, that's so right.
Wild. It's like those two movies together. It's so crazy with Kevin Costner.
And he directed Volcano.
And he directed Volcano.
Right.
The wild. Just
Totally wild.
I am curious what people's reaction to this movie was seeing it for the first time, because I was looking, I was curious, did it play in the States? And it did, but we didn't have cable growing up. I didn't have cable until the early 2000s. And it apparently played on TBS on the 13th of January, 1985, with Ted Turner presenting an introduction to it. And I think in the US, the film that most people remember is like I think it's called The Day After. Is that what it was called?
Mm-hmm.
And I've actually never seen that either. I think my parents never let me watch like nuclear things, because now that I'm thinking about it, there's like so many that came out that time that I never got to see. But I do remember growing up at that time, because we Mary Beth, you had mentioned When the Wind Blows, and we had seen that for the podcast, because we had talked with filmmaker Camille Griffin, and that was her choice for it. And I watched that movie, and I'm like, this is bleak upon bleak upon bleak. And then you watch Threads, and it's like, no, here, hold my beer. I'm gonna like take this to the next extreme. And I'm with the 80s. I just remember as a kid the hiding under the desks when the sirens would go off, and you think about that, and then you think about the things that people do in Threads, which is also something they do when the wind blows, when they're making like their little forts out of mattresses and taking door springs off and everything to make like little protective areas, and how that does not help you whatsoever. This movie sort of like pops that bubble in terms of not necessarily the romanticism, but the naivete about like what would happen in a nuclear war. Because I think like a lot of kids growing up, it's just like, you just hide under your desk, everything's gonna be okay. Nope.
Nope.
It's not.
Nope. I think also just like for the movie, I think what they decide to include is really haunting.
Yeah.
The writing and directing of it is really interesting and artful, and just like that you're focusing on this two families, middle class families, lower middle class. And, it's all about like trying to make a cup of tea while someone's got radiation burns, what the hospital looks like.
Oh.
And then they put that makeshift group of local politicians together and they're unequipped to handle the situation, but they're doing their best. And I just think it's really interesting. It's not the usual story of like, oh my God, we've got a 10-hour countdown or something. And
there isn't like there's no saving the day. There's only people trying to it's so exemplary of like someone trying to like plug the hole with their finger, and everything keeps sprouting out around you, in terms of like, no one knows actually how to no one knows,
and nobody's trying.
And nobody's trying
for a long time. For like an hour, you're just watching people turn off the news.
I know. Exactly. There's that moment in the bar where like there's a news report, and it's something very, I can't remember exactly what it was, but there was like this moment, and it was on the bar TV, and the bartender just changed the channel. And I imagine you could see on his mind like, oh, this is bringing people down. I need people to be drinking and having fun at my bar, so I'm just going to change the channel. And then everyone's like, no, turn it back. But like, there's a lot of that in this beginning half, and I think I don't know. We have for some reason, I think this movie has aged incredibly well, because while there's like a lot of 1985-isms in it, the fact that like that there's news all over the place, but yet we still are ignoring it, just feels so pertinent to today, where we are assaulted by so much different news, and it's hard to figure out what's going on, because everyone has their own prerogatives with what they're showing you. And with watching this now, like after Russia's war against the Ukraine starting, it's just, there's a lot in here that just makes me really uncomfortable with the direction. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, just the other morning, I was listening to the news about, the coral reefs are going to disappear in 20 years. And it's like, am I really going to keep making my daughter's lunch? Like, shouldn't I stop everything right now? Like, we need those reefs.
Right.
And I think this kind of goes back to what I was like mentioning a little bit earlier with like movies like this are scarier to me than any horror movie. I will watch a nasty horror movie until like any day, but war movies, I can't. Like, my husband loves watching like historical fiction. I just can't do it.
Can't
it's
either.
So much more fucked up to me, because it actually like and I think it's pretty, people can like identify with this, is like with horror, there's like that fictional divide, even if it like, but something about the, even if it's like a historical fiction, it still happened. And it's just like the reality of that is so fucking terrifying. And nuclear war is one of the things that scares me the most. Like, weird kid, looked into it, got too terrified of it. And I try not to think about it, because if I think too hard about it, I get very scared. And it's just,
how
like,
are you with global
those,
warming?
terrible. That one doesn't terrify me as much, because I have actively resisted the urge to look too much into it. I know how bad it is, but I don't glom onto it the same way with my brain. I don't know. It's weird. Brains, OCD, what we cling on to, but like nuclear war. And that's why I never watched Threads. I was like, I don't want to know. I don't want to know. And
now you know.
I've watched it twice. Now I've watched it twice. So now I know. Oh, now I know. But like it's okay. And again, like, these are movies that are important that I think people don't necessarily categorize, might not think of as horror movies, but it's like, it is a horror movie. It's fucking terrifying. And I think this is one of those movies that kind of shows the elasticity of genre labels, and how like genre labels are silly sometimes, a lot of the time. As someone who loves horror, I think genre labels can be very silly. And I think Threads proves like it's a horror movie, and also not a horror movie in the traditional sense, like what you wouldn't expect it to be, as horrifying as it is.
Yeah, because it doesn't have any like supernatural component or anything like that. It is just a could be possible film.
We talked a little bit about this, but I do love the structure, particularly from the beginning, where we have sort of like well, first of all, we get a shot of a spider, which right off the bat, I am an arachnophobe like to the nth degree. And so I can't watch them on television. And I forgot that there was like a spider at the beginning of this. And I'm like, gosh darn it. I appreciated like the connection with the idea that like we're all connected by these threads, but at the center of it is the spider that wants to fucking eat you. And so like that's sort of like the introduction to everything else, where it's like, yes, we're all connected, but we're all kind of stuck together, and there's sometimes nothing we can do about that there is a spider on this web that wants to eat us. And I think that is such a haunting image that is never like addressed again. It's not something that I think a lot of times filmmakers would probably start peppering in like webs or spiders or something throughout to make like some kind of point. And this one doesn't do it. It just has this little moment that's sort of like, we're all attached on this threads, and there's a spider and it wants to eat us. And then it sort of just continues with that. And yes, the movie is called Threads, but that's like the only like connection that there is to that. And I think that's really an interesting choice.
Well, the kids start like, they watch that in the future post apocalypse.
Oh, that's right.
They start pulling, like they're given a job to pull threads out of things. Like that's all they do all day. It's freaky. I don't know what they're doing. They watch that video, like objects and words. And that one old lady's got it memorized. It's super creepy.
She's seen it so many times, and she's just mouthing the words. Ooh.
Like,
I just like, it really doesn't hit me how weird the ending of this movie is. And again, like there's people talking about how this is the first accurate representation of what an actual nuclear winter would look like. And it changes to, again, a horror movie so quickly, because it's so outside. I think what's so interesting is it's so outside of what we would expect in reality, but it's like technically accurate, but I think we're all just so like, can't imagine what that would look like, and seeing it feels so foreign, because it's just like, how could this happen to like the human population? There's no way it could be eradicated that easily. And I think this just shatters a lot of perceptions of like I think this shatters perceptions that we aren't as fragile as we are as people. And I think that also scares me, acknowledging how fragile human beings are. I think that's like really terrifying.
Yeah, not just one human, but all of humanity.
Like humanity as a species, and like as the human population,
But what makes us human? Because like you do see the few stragglers that make it, but they've lost language, and purpose, and any kind of relationship to the earth to kind of sustain themselves. Like when you first see them the new generation born out of the ashes, and they're trying to get that little girl's rabbit to eat. And it's like suddenly you're watching Clockwork Orange, because they're like,
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
give me go. They have a new, like, stunted words. And one of the phrases that I always say to my partner, like, it haunts me, is baby, come on, baby, come on. Like,
Yeah.
they just know a few words. This is a scene where a young girl is pregnant and she's trying to go have labor in a makeshift hospital, and she's saying baby coming as best she can, but they don't let her stay in the hospital, if you call it a hospital.
And that's horrifying too. That idea that like this thing that is supposed to be there to help, and it's in the future, and they're like, no, we have no room for you. Just like that idea that something as important, I think as important as a lot of people hold in our society of birth and, continuing life past, your own self is now an issue in this post, where like they don't even care that she is pregnant, that she's going to have this baby. And it's, it's like there's this push and pull, where it's like in a lot of post-apocalyptic films that would be like a cause for celebration. We must protect, that way we can continue on civilization, and no one seems to care anymore.
Right, you would make that the focus of, we got to save this one baby. Well, when her mom dies too, she's just poking her, and poking her. Oh,
well, it's like what happens like when death is just so part of your day to day. It's like, what, like there's nothing we can really do about it. And I mean, like, and then I know this is in the 80s, but I think it still speaks true today, of kind of, it shows this idea and how I sort of feel. And Stuart, I'm curious how you feel, because you are a parent. I'm not a parent, but it's like, it feels very much like a scary, like, why bring kid? Like, why are you bringing a kid into this world kind of like conversation, which like my husband and I have a lot. And like, and I'm curious about your perspective on that, Stuart, like as a parent, like, and having a kid, like in this contemporary moment, like it's got to be terrifying, right? Like I can only fucking imagine.
I mean, you can only do it if you believe that another generation can save us,
Yeah.
Like, it's not.
I think I haven't hit that hopefulness yet. It gives me.
Well, that hopefulness might be as dumb as them making tea just before they get nuked, like, sorry, Gloria. I'm not sure. It might be just a selfish move to have a kid at this point.
Like, there's no right answer. You know what I mean? And it's just like, I think this movie brings up a really interesting question of like raising kid. And I think it doesn't engage with that as much, but I think having a pregnant protagonist is so, like, having a pregnant protagonist is important, I think, to show, like, I mean, how life has to continue afterward. But then again, I don't know. I just think it's really interesting to have that integrated into this movie about like continuing on with life, and like, is it worth it after something like this? And I don't think it has an answer, but I think it is kind of asking that question in a really interesting way. Like, I don't know. I
mean, I think that you could ask that question now, like you are, but also it's also not too late right now. So the big horror is our capacity for denial, because there, it's ridiculous. I mean, I'm not quite sure how to fix things, but we could. Everybody could, move whatever. We could all figure out how to fix things and do it tomorrow.
Yeah. We really could. I think that is the most frustrating thing about like the denial and how hard-headed people are about things. And it's just, selfishness of humanity is also frustrating a lot of the time, especially.
Or the immediateness, like they're being so short-sighted.
Yeah. And well, Mary Beth, you said that this movie asks questions, but I do think the ending kind of gives us an answer. I think the ending of this movie is like, because again, we have this idea that, the what's her name? Ruth in the beginning is pregnant, and, she's going to have a kid. And so we're going to see like maybe the generations of life continuing. And then the kid is obviously has a couple issues and continues on trying to eke out some existence. And then she has a kid, and the last freeze frame of this movie is basically holding this wreck of a baby and realizing any kind of like naivety that we have that there is a possibility for life after this. I think the ending of this movie, which is a freeze frame and a horror, like it it's like the silent scream at the end of this film of her just looking at life with abject horror on her face. And it's so upsetting. It almost, like, the first time I watched this, I kind of thought the last bit turns a little bit into a melodrama over, like, it felt very melodramatic in some spots, but like on the second watch I was like, no, I think this is trying to hone in on this idea that if this happens, life is never going to continue the same. And I do think that final freeze frame is basically saying, no, there's no hope. And that's so depressing.
It's so
depressing.
It's a siren of a movie. It's a siren.
Yeah.
Like, wake
yes,
up!
It really is though. Like, that's the best way to describe it. It is just like a warning. Like, guys, we're not even gonna try to like make any kind of like, this isn't a metaphor anymore. Like, this is just like what's gonna happen. Like, fuck a metaphor. We can't be subtle. We need to hit you with the hammer that is Threads. And honestly, if that couldn't have shocked the rest of the world into like getting their shit together, then I'm not really sure what will. That's not hopeful. Yeah. I'm sorry. Should be more hopeful than that.
It's funny how there have been like global warming catastrophe movies that just don't seem to hit a nerve. And I always wonder why that is.
I think the problem with movies about climate change is that there isn't, like, you can make a disaster movie and have it, what am I trying to say?
There's no immediacy.
It's harder. I feel like with bombs, it's just like, exactly, there's like one event and it's really scary. And I think it's when there isn't like one event that begins and ends, it's like people don't understand. Like, yeah, that was a really bad storm, but that's a storm. It's not part of global. I think it's harder for people to maybe conceptualize it because it's not as tangible as a bomb, maybe.
Well, and I think we're living through that right now with COVID, because, you know, it's like everyone wants to focus on like these big events. Like 9/11 became a huge event because it was a concrete event that happened, had casualties all associated with that. And now, like, there was a statistic back while COVID was, you know, at its peak, where it was like, yeah, we're losing as many people that died in 9/11 by a certain amount of time, like constantly. But people don't see that because it's like a spread out event vice, you know, something that is happening immediately that be like, yep, that happened. I see that, which is what I think like this movie is like, yeah, there was a bomb. We're showing the after effects of that. And I think that might be kind of why it's easier for people to deny like climate change films or whatever, because it feels like it's been such a gradual thing. And now we're getting into this point where it's like, I mean, it's 105 degrees here in Omaha, Nebraska, and I am sweating my ass off. And it's like, there's all this type of stuff that is happening, but no one wants to open their eyes to it because it is not a concrete event. And I think that maybe that's part of it. I don't know.
Why do we?
It's easier to be in denial, I think.
I know.
To be in denial. So many mysteries of human behavior. Like, I would love that movies could change the world.
Yeah, I know. I mean, you think about like how many people have seen Oppenheimer and getting like, I don't know, that movie hit me really hard just because of like I don't know if either of you have seen it yet, but just like this idea of this man that, you know, gets involved with something and he is looking at it purely from a theoretical perspective, and then all of a sudden sees firsthand the results of what happens because he was interested in it. And it's interesting watching this movie after watching Oppenheimer, just because of,
interesting.
I don't know.
I didn't even think about that connection. Oops. Because I haven't seen Oppenheimer yet. Well, and also I think it also goes to show with Oppenheimer, like, we're still fascinated by this stuff. You know, like, it's still so scary and so real. Like, even if it's not as urgent feeling as in the 80s, when it was more of like, I still think it's still a very real threat, but it was more of like a newer threat that I feel like people were like more terrified of. And now it's just like, we're just generally under like a low level, maybe nuclear threat at all times. And we're just kind of used to that panic. Like, isn't that just great?
I guess it's like we walk by homeless people.
Yeah.
And
you're just like, it is. But again, like, we're still so fascinated and terrified by it. But we're still having the same problems. It's just very, I think, again, it just keeps coming back down to denial. I think denial is the theme of this episode today, everybody. Human beings' capacity for denial and pretending that everything is okay when it very obviously is not.
But I do think it's interesting that, you know, this challenge that you guys have of what is the movie that haunts you the most. When I did my soul searching about it, and besides the egg scene in Funny Games, when I had to really do my soul searching about it, it was Threads. And so I feel like it's interesting to think about for you guys, is it more, you know, who's more responsive to like a bad, more fantastic presence in a mask, or by dread, or by like gore? I find it interesting to think through that stuff, which you guys must do all the time.
Well, I mean, like, we've had like the craziest range of movies on this podcast. Like, we let people know it doesn't have to be a horror movie. Like, we talked about If These Walls Could Talk, which is a movie about abortion. We talked about Silkwood, the Meryl Streep movie.
Oh, I love Silkwood.
And we've
An
talked
Awfully
about
Big Adventure.
Yeah, An Awfully Big Adventure. Like, we've talked about such a wide range of stuff about what scares people. And it's always so cool to hear these stories about like everyone's own individual experiences with, I mean, like, we say this like a broken record, but we didn't know how long we could do this podcast because we were like, there's only so many movies out there that could have scared people, but we haven't found the limit yet. And it hasn't been hard to get people to pick things that haven't been covered. So like, it's kind of cool. It's really, really interesting and cool to experience.
What always surprises me and brings me so much joy in these discussions is when I'm sitting down to watch the movie, me trying to figure out what is the moment that terrified someone, because it's different for every single person. Because this is a movie with a litany of things that were coming off, you know, straight off my head. The images of the bomb dropping, the moment that is still seared in my head is this woman on the street looking, and her hand is on her face, and then you see down her leg that she has peed herself out of fear. Like that moment has been like stuck in my head, and I can't. And so like I'm watching this movie and I'm thinking, what is the moment that Stewart is going to talk about? And for you, it was the after effects with watching the television, which is something I never would have thought of as like that moment. And so that's what I love about this is finding out what exactly, because a lot of times it's not the moment that I think it's going to be.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that.
Yeah. Cool.
I am curious because the structure of this movie, so the first time I watched this, when we watched it last year, there's so much happening that I don't think I picked up on a lot of like the interactions and the way things are played out between the characters, because it is like one scene after another, and it has a very compulsive feel to it where there's so much happening. And yes, we're following kind of this family throughout this, but like I guess I didn't, when I was watching it, just was not either in the headspace to follow along completely. So this watch, I was sitting down and I was really fascinated by the structure. And I was kind of curious what you guys thought about the narration that sort of is interspersed with this human drama that is happening. Did that work for you guys? Because I did find something where it was apparently a point of contention between the screenwriter and the director, because the screenwriter did not like the narration because he felt that it was detrimental to the drama. And so I'm curious what you guys kind of thought about the way that this movie is structured with the human drama and then the very, I don't know, almost like detached feel of like what is happening, almost like it is a documentary. Did that work for you guys? It worked for me.
It worked in a way that made it feel like a nature documentary and that we were being examined by aliens, and it kind of freaked me out. You know what I mean?
That's exactly what I would say. And that's what I loved about it. It feels very cold and detached.
Yeah.
It's almost like we're in the pages of a history book in the future or something, which also freaks me out.
I think that's like an added to me for me, because I was like, it feels like this is like a transmission from a different time. That's like it's like a warning movie from the future. That's like, hello, I'm David Attenborough for the nuclear holocaust. Be careful, kind of thing.
Or it's like a computer has survived and is just downloading. Oh, there was this other species.
Right. I'm glad to hear that, because when I read that I was like, it surprises me that that was like a point of contention, because I think there is that, as you said, Stuart, this sort of like detached nature to it that kind of feels alien to the drama, but it kind of accentuates what's happening and makes it feel more real, because it is listing out all of the facts. Like, it is just very factual. This happens, this is what's going to happen next. When the government breaks down, this is the three things that are going to happen. And I think it does a whole lot of like filling in the pieces a little bit of, so that there's not a whole lot of like exposition dumps about people talking about what they're doing. It allows the drama to feel very real and very grounded. And then, like you said, Mary Beth, definitely not nature documentary where like we're watching Homo sapiens play out the last dregs of their life. And it's, I don't know, it
but
works
by the
for
way,
me.
like the detachment of those announcements are just as detached as all the humans in the beginning who aren't paying
Yeah.
attention. And
Yeah.
they keep turning things off that are like, and there are, as they call, political subversives and potential subversives must
Oh,
be,
yes.
who are trying to say, hey, this is going to happen. And people are, booing them.
That moment was one of the more horrifying moments for me, just like the people protesting and the idea of like freedom of speech and freedom to be able to protest nuclear war, and then them being beaten or dragged away, or people are like, no. And the idea is very simple. It's like, this is a blue collar town, which I think is such a very important distinction, because this is all about making things with your hands. And this is all about that aspect of it. And they're saying, you guys are struggling, and we're spending all this money on nuclear war and not on protecting our people and, allowing our people to flourish. And so there's that aspect of it that is immediately like booed and torn down. And it's, to me, that human drama is somehow more horrifying than what follows, because what follows feels fatalistic. It feels like this happened and there's nothing I can do about it. But that moment of trying to let the world know what's happening or what could happen, this watch, it just like gave me a pit in my stomach.
Well, it probably doesn't help that we're still dealing with that now, where people protesting get arrested and all this stuff. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just like, a lot of this feels so true even still to life now about what happens when people speak up. And it's kind of depressing, really. A lot of this podcast has shown me that we really haven't grown much as much as we'd like to say we've grown as a society since the 70s and 80s. We're kind of in a very similar spot in a lot of regards, and it's just very weird to just kind of reflect on that via cinema. It's very interesting and a little bit heartbreaking.
And maybe why what you're doing is important and why horror is important.
On that incredible note, do we want to wrap up and give this a rating out of 5?
Sounds good.
Terry, how many bleak endings out of 5 do you give Threads?
When I logged this on Letterboxd this time, I noticed that I had given it 4 stars last time, and when I watched it the first time, and I don't think I do think the ending kind of gets into melodrama in a way that kind of I don't know, it feels like there's like an ending point and then it just keeps going, and it's like, oh my gosh, how much more trauma can we endure in this film? But on this watch, it worked so much better for me, so I'm probably going to bump it up half, and it is 4.5 bleak endings for me, because I think this movie has a point. I think it has a really good intention, and I think it is incredibly well made from an acting perspective at the very least. Just the way things unfold and the performances that we are given in that first hour of that slow burn is just, I don't know, it was pretty much perfection for me. So yeah, 4.5, I think, for me. What about you, Mary Beth?
This is definitely found under an incredible movie that I never want to watch again kind of situation. I think it's one of those movies that I think is very important. And I think it's also really cool that this was a movie made by the BBC for television, and that these kinds of things were happening on TV and being broadcast to people. I think it's a really interesting case of I don't know if I don't know if censorship is the right word for how things are today, but they're very sanitized comparatively speaking. And it's kind of, it's cool and interesting and a little bit sad to look back at to what things like were on TV. And yes, this was never shown again after 1985, but still interesting to see risks that were being taken in media. And like, this just also makes me think of Ghost Watch in 1992 when they, you know, released that. And I think everything about it is just like so fascinating and weird. And I'm glad something like this exists and also hate it at the same time. It's just one of those movies that like contains a lot of contradictions for me. And I'm going to give it also 4.5 out of 5 bleak endings. Stuart, you have the final word. How many bleak endings out of 5 do you give Threads?
5, man.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. Cool.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Stuart, for joining us. Are you on social media? Where can our listeners follow you? And what do you have that you can talk about? The floor is yours.
Well, I have my movie Bad Things. Please watch it on Shudder. And I'm on Instagram, Stewart Thorndike.
Oh, yeah.
Cool.
Listeners, you've heard from us. We want to hear from you. What was your experience with Threads? Did you also watch it at an impressionable age and terrify yourself? You should let us know by sending us an email at scarredforlifepodcast@gmail.com. Or you can reach out to us directly on Twitter. I am at MB McAndrews.
I'm at Gaily Dreadful. And I just want to also say, I think there's any age is an impressionable age with this movie. I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah, I saw when I was 41, I guess. And no.
Yeah, fair.
Terrified
At
me.
what age? Any age. All ages. All age trauma.
Yes, but I'm at Gaily Dreadful.
And of course, don't forget to follow the podcast on Twitter at Scarred Podcast. And if you are making the exodus from Twitter, we are also on Instagram at Scarred for Life Podcast, if you'd like to find us there.
And please don't forget to review, rate, and subscribe. And if you want to help support us, we are on Patreon.
Thank you to Eric Power for our artwork. Thank you to Sean Keller for our music. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Please stay safe out there, but most importantly, stay creepy.
And until next time.
Stay creepy.